There's a strange and uncomfortable feeling in modern life right now. The feeling that something important is missing. We can feel it everywhere. Something is missing in the world and especially in our individual lives. On paper, life is fine, but that's the problem. It's just fine. And underneath the fine, there's a hole. We're overstimulated but undersatisfied, constantly busy but not progressing anywhere specific. This feeling has a name, a crisis of meaning. It's the defining condition of modern life, and you, me, and millions like us have been feeling it for years. This video is about three things: why you feel this way, how the modern world exacerbates this feeling, and how to take action so you can find a way out. It isn't doom or nihilism, and it isn't woo-woo spirituality. It's a game plan on how we can live deliberately and retain our humanity in a world increasingly hostile to the things that make us human. A few weeks ago, I was at a barbecue with a group of friends. Just as you would expect from a living room full of good millennials, in between bites of chicken and potatoes, we were all talking around the table about the issues everyone in our generation is familiar with. The elusive dreams of home ownership, the crushing cost of living in our coastal city, and of course, what was, at the time, the news of the day: the government's declassifying of a tranche of materials related to UFOs and aliens. Now, for a generation raised on E.T. and the X-Files, you would think that this would be a big moment for all of us. The government just basically admitted that we might not be alone in the universe. We have all waited for this moment since the debut of Independence Day. And yet, we just couldn't seem to get around the fact that the disclosures only made all of us more skeptical. Not because the claims were fantastic, but because it was the government making those claims. That fact alone caused us to call everything else into question. The conversation at this barbecue might have been unique to the headlines that week, but the inescapable sense that the government is lying to us, none of us will ever be able to own a home, and that all of us are constantly at the mercy of job-related dread is something a room full of any friends from any generation in any city can relate to right now. We all nervously laughed at the realization of what we weren't talking about either: our country's newly found war in Iran, the Epstein files, whose release only a couple months ago would have brought down the government in any healthy society, or the fact that in this room of less than 10 people, we had both people who were just hired by new AI firms and also people who were recently laid off from their jobs because of AI. In other words, this one living room was essentially a who's who of the modern crisis of everything that we are currently living through. Now, I'm going to guess that this whole scene might sound eerily similar to one you could find yourself a part of. Swap out my friends for yours, and this could describe just about any living room in America. And while the details might shift, the feeling is one we all know intimately. Something is deeply wrong in the modern world. We are a generation who feels constantly overstimulated but undersatisfied. We are socially connected but existentially alone. We are constantly busy but utterly directionless. Our lives are not in emergency mode, but everything still feels stagnant. Many of us work jobs that can pay the bills for now, but any hope of buying a house or affording a family seems laughable. We're all just drifting, carried by the waves, but never consciously swimming towards any specific shore. And when we try to break down the everything crisis into digestible parts, politics, war, technology, the climate, we immediately find ourselves drowning in the sense that everything is wrong, that so much is wrong that the hope of fixing any of it feels impossible. It feels like somewhere along the line, the whole world took a wrong turn. This feeling is ubiquitous in modern life, even if we struggle to articulate it. The fact that so many of us feel it so acutely might be the one thing everyone in our culture can actually agree on. Doing okay on the surface, but living a life without true meaning. And I think that is what is at the core of all of this. It's a crisis of meaning, and once you notice it in the world, you see it everywhere you look. Meaning in life is different for everyone, of course. And if I could give you a bulletproof definition, this video would be a lot shorter. But the contours of it are universal. It's the felt sense that your life has existential weight to it, that you're part of a community, no matter how small, that you aren't just drifting from one meeting that could have been an email to another. It's the feeling that you're connected to something bigger and that your suffering, your relationships, your responsibilities, your goals, and your sacrifices are part of a story that's worth something. Meaning is what makes life feel alive instead of merely participatory. In our parents' world, the one we grew up in and were trained to prepare for, society had an abundance of meaning structures. You could find it in a job, one that you worked for 30, 40 years and then collected a pension from. You could find it in culture because there was a single coherent culture you could latch onto. You could find it in something like the American dream because back then it hadn't turned into a nightmare yet. Religion, institutions, community, clear, defined family roles. Sure, you were free to go out and cut your own path, but if you didn't, you could find a default elsewhere. But that world is gone, and for good reason. The institutions and ways of being that existed in that world by default were also brutally oppressive for others. Nevertheless, those structures, whatever their faults, have been ground down and crushed to dust under the weight of modernity. And right now, we live with the consequences. Politics becomes spectacle. Everyone around us seems like they're either brainwashed into a radical political ideology or have become radically nihilistic. Jobs feel empty. Dating feels transactional. People medicate themselves to wake up and again to fall asleep. We have become spiritually numb, despite living in material abundance. Modern civilization excels at producing stimulation, comfort, and distraction, but it fails miserably to provide meaning, belonging, transcendence, or psychological coherence. We have more access to information than at any other period in human history, but 90% of it is bullshit, and no one can quite tell which 90%. And to make matters worse, all of this is compounded by an economic reality that makes it harder and harder to pay rent and afford groceries, let alone to have kids, leave a toxic workplace, or prepare for the future. As a result, millions of people live with a persistent sense of emptiness, fragmentation, and existential drift. So they retreat inward, scrolling endlessly, slugging through pointless jobs, and living life on repeat. The generational task of our time is to consciously rebuild ways of living that preserve our humanity in an increasingly dehumanizing world. Modernity did not destroy meaning directly, but it did dismantle the automatic systems that we could once rely on to generate it, and it replaced them with systems that require active resistance to produce meaning at all. So why is this happening? Most answers rely on overly simplistic explanations that either place the blame on capitalism or technology broadly. Others highlight a handful of people at the top of the political and techno elite, and while these answers have some truth to them, the reality is that there's no monthly meeting of billionaires where they brainstorm about the new and improved ways to siphon meaning from people's lives. If they all disappeared today, we wouldn't magically live in a utopia by morning. The truth is that our day-to-day lives have become increasingly captured by systems that are actively hostile to our humanity. And if you don't actively resist them, your life will get sucked into the gears and ground down too. Politics runs on power. Culture obsesses over performance. Technology optimizes for efficiency. Media thrives on outrage. The cumulative result is a world that becomes hostile to contemplation, meaning, depth, and human flourishing. And while the root causes of this disconnection in modern life are structural, they are all exacerbated by a class of political and techno elites that intentionally and actively try to convince us that all of this is neutral or natural or the necessary price of progress. But it's not true. The systems themselves might be an accidental byproduct of our current age, but the cultural enforcement of those systems as inevitable isn't. And everything hinges on that point, because once you recognize that these dehumanizing systems are not inevitable, the door opens for a different way. A way of being in the world that protects and uplifts the wonderful adventure of life and all the things that make living so beautiful. I know it sounds cliche, but I promise you this is not woo-woo spiritual YouTube self-help bullshit. But the way out is through. The true savior is internal. You have to want it, because desire to change is the prerequisite for progress. But the path requires that you resist the drift by dedicating yourself to living an examined life, one that is consciously constructed. And that's the contradiction at the heart of all of this. The cause is structural, but the responsibility is still personal. This fucked up world is not your fault, but getting out from under it is your responsibility. No one's coming to save you. Spend any amount of time online and you can see that people are desperate for meaning in their lives. I see a lot of posts and comments from people who are in their 20s or early 30s, all saying things like, I have no life, no friends, I'm addicted to XYZ substances, or I live with XYZ disorder, I have no romantic partner, blah, blah, and I've tried to get better and get off my ass and change my life, but nothing ever works. Trust me, man, I get that. Truly, I do. And it breaks my heart to hear young people saying that, because I have been there too. I know what it feels like to feel disconnected and drifting for years, but I promise you, there is a way out. For me, this lesson came during an extended period of grief and depression, when my life felt like everything had come crashing down. And when it did fall apart, I had no choice but to tear my life down to the studs and start over from the ground up. My job, my relationships, my goals, what I wanted out of life, all of it had to be under a microscope, and I had to make big changes. For me, it took a full collapse before I could rebuild the structure. I'm making this video because I hope that for you, change doesn't have to come from a pile of rubble. And the truth is brutal, but it is simple. If you have been trying to make the changes you need in your life and it still hasn't worked, it's time to try something different. If you really want a way out of this horrible, disconnected feeling that you just can't shake, you have to work harder for longer. But it's not going to come from some dollar store change your life in 30 days bullshit. If you're going to change your life, you got to change it for life. And change is a process. It doesn't end, and there is no final destination. It's a systematic reorientation of your priorities and goals. Okay, so what does that look like in practice? It's easier said than done, so start at the root. Create a personal constitution, a rule book of 3 or 5 or 10 principles you live your life by, and literally write them out. And take it seriously. Don't be afraid to iterate on it. Don't make it sappy self-help AI slop. Make it real and make it yours. What are the things that would make both 8-year-old you and 80-year-old you proud? What do you actually value? What do you actually care about? If you had no obstacles, what would you do with your life? Write it out, commit it to memory, and most importantly, filter every life decision you make through it. If a choice or a habit doesn't serve your constitution, scrap that shit and never look back. I'm going to do a whole video on this personal constitution thing in the future. I know it doesn't sound like much more than a journaling exercise, but I think you will be surprised at how clarifying it can be. I can genuinely say that it was one of the most impactful things I did in my adult life. But the Constitution is the first brick. The rest of the structure, your health, your aspirations, your relationships, your spiritual life, that only comes from doing the hard work, the building, every day after. Because if you do not consciously decide what you stand for and intentionally design your life around that, you risk spending decades drifting between one meaningless job to another, from one unaffordable city to the next. Trust me, I'm speaking from experience. The political and techno elite and the systems they operate in have a rule book of their own. And I think we're all seeing what happens when we let them design life for us. They create a system that is actively hostile to our humanity. If there is one thing that I learned going through this process myself, it's that you don't change your life to better direct you to some specific goal. You change your life and your goals become crystallized. You make the positive change first. You quit drinking or smoking weed and playing video games. You work a shit job for a little while and save up money. You get up, go to the gym, you put yourself out there in the dating world, you show up to the function, or you fucking plan it yourself. And eventually, you look back a few years later and realize that everything has changed. You stopped drifting and finally oriented yourself towards shore. You aren't the same person you used to be, and your goals and aspirations aren't either. And that's how you'll know it worked. So get out there and work it. Thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed this content or at least found it useful. And if you end up trying this whole personal constitution idea, let me know in the comments below. I'd love to hear about it. Thanks again.